co-hosted by BLAC and the Liberal Art Department's Diverse Voices Lecture Series. So BLAC is a student-led organization. There are 3 leaders currently, each leading a separate committee. Our primary goal is to create a safe space for Black, Indigenous, people of color students, and also serve as a space to educate those who may not be members of the community on some of the different issues that BIPOC students and BIPOC people in general may face in their daily lives and things of that sort. Today we are joined by Jaime Arroyo, Salina Almanzar, who currently isn't here at the moment, and we're also joined by Kareena Rios. So thank you all for coming. All of our guests today are elected young officials of color here in Lancaster City in their respective fields. So I would ask if you two would like to introduce yourselves, or if you'd like me to introduce you. I'm prepared for either or, so.
I'm happy to do this.
Introduce myself, or do you want to go ahead first, Jaime?
I'll yield to you, Kareena. Go ahead.
It's funny because Jaime and I actually have a similar background. We went to the same through the same school district and everything, so it's funny when we get to be in these spaces together now. I actually went to school with his brother. We graduated in the same class, so funny how small Lancaster is, but yet it's still considered, a third class city and everything in Pennsylvania. Anyways, yes, like Shazim kindly said, my name is Kareena Rios, and I serve on the school board for the school district of Lancaster, actually completing my first year this December. Like I had kind of mentioned, I grew up in the school district of Lancaster as well. Both my parents are from Puerto Rico, but they chose to raise me here, even though that was kind of like a back and forth conversation in my household all the time of where we need to be living. Is Lancaster the right place, or is Puerto Rico the right place to raise a family? It was like always back and forth. Anyways, yeah, I graduated from McCaskey in 2009. I studied at HAC for a short period of time, but ultimately I dropped out. I was working full time at the same time, trying to pay rent, living on my own, and I actually just was kind of tired of living in Lancaster and decided to uproot my life. I moved to the Seattle area and started working full time as a bank teller. At that time, I didn't really consider myself political at all. But there was a lot of conversation going on in 2011 around wealth inequality, the wealth gap, the 1%, the 99%. So we actually dealt with a lot of protests in Seattle at that time around these issues. Occupy Wall Street was a big thing, and so a lot of that was going on around me. I ended up getting married and settling down. I left banking. I hated it. I felt like I was contributing to a really nasty situation. In terms of like dealing with customers, I was like the only translator for my branch. So all of the folks who spoke Spanish would come to my teller line. And I just learned a lot about the inequities that were in our financial system. And ultimately, it just was a hard place to be in, and I chose to leave. Anyway, fast forwarding a little bit, I came back to Lancaster after 2016 election. Decided to settle down here. My mom's 5 minutes away from me now, which I love because I love being close to her. And I realized there was a lot of room for young Latinx people to get involved in our local government. I felt like it was our time to do more and kind of contribute to the city that helped raise me. So I got involved with local organizations like Lancaster Stands Up and CASA, which isn't as well known in Lancaster, but they actually have a branch in York as well as parts of Maryland. And they do a lot of work around empowering immigrants and the Latinx community. So I started registering voters, started knocking on doors for local candidates, started learning more about local offices, and started attending school board meetings. After my son started kindergarten, I actually got more interested in what was going on in my old school district. And I decided to run for office, and here I am on the school board. So it's not really like a crazy, exciting thing that I did. I just started attending meetings and realizing that it was something that could I could see myself doing. Um, so yeah, that's where I'm at. That's me.
I'm happy to go next, Shazim, if that works.
All right with me.
So yeah, Jaime Arroyo. I currently serve on city council, started my first term this past January. Crazy year to start life in public service, but excited to do so. During my day job, I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Community Action Partnership, which I started just a few months ago in that position as well. So it's been quite a year for a lot of transition for me. But I'm originally from Puerto Rico. I was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and was raised in Lancaster City. Graduated from McCaskey High School back in 2006. Shout out to Osman, who I see on this call here, who we pretty much grew up together and graduated the same year. So good to see that you're on here. And right after, actually, went and attended Millersville University. So I was the first person in my family to go to and through college. And right out of high school, I actually received it's kind of similar story to Kareena. I received a scholarship for Fulton Bank to work there part-time as a teller and a customer service rep through college. So they gave me a little bit of money for some books and a part-time job. And, my mom was a teller. So when I graduated, I wanted to do whatever those guys in the offices did. They got to wear a nice suit and work with money. So that was my career goal. So after college, I joined Fulton Bank's management training program and also became a mortgage loan officer and did various positions in the banking system, from investment banking to also branch management. And similar to what Kareena said, you kind of notice a lot of the inequities that are built in the banking system. And specifically for me, I grew up in a time where Lancaster was developing into the city that you see today. 20 years ago, a lot of the buildings, businesses, and the development that we experienced downtown didn't exist. So a lot of that was happening as I was kind of coming into my career. And it just didn't quite sit right with me. A lot of the stuff that was happening while Lancaster as a city benefited, the entire city didn't benefit. So you saw poverty rates continue to rise as high as 30% in some years, and really affecting people of color. So the African American and Latinx communities were hit very hard during this time, even while we kept hearing this story of this downtown revitalization. And then working within the banking system, I also realized that, like, okay, there's tools and capital that can be accessed, but it's not really accessible to everyone the way that it's set up. So, one of the things that I wanted to get into was, or figure out, was how do I use my skill set for good? How do I use what I know in a way that's going to have a positive impact in our community? And I went to Drexel University to get my MBA there and graduated in 2016. Shortly after, joined Assets, which is a local nonprofit that helps. So you go Dragons, which is a local nonprofit that helps startup businesses as well as existing businesses, typically around women, African American, and Latinx owned businesses. So really underrepresented entrepreneurs, to make sure that they have access to the training resources and capital resources that they need to start and grow these businesses. From there, I joined most recently Community Action Partnership. And throughout this time, when I decided to run for office, it was really in that same vein of how do we make sure that we're doing economic development and community development in the right way that makes sure that all can thrive and is accessible to everyone that lives in Lancaster City and doesn't just benefit the few. So a lot of my work during the day and also with City Council really looks through the lens of equity and making sure that we're building a Lancaster that's prosperous for everyone. So.
Nice, thank you very much. Salina, would you like to go next with your introduction?
Sure. I'm so sorry I'm late. I'm obsessed with my planner, and if I write it in my planner, I think it's Bible, and I put 2 p.m. instead of 1 p.m. So I'm just like sitting here doing work, and then Oz was like, they're starting. So thanks, Oz. So I'm Salina Almanzar. We're just giving our background, I'm assuming. Okay, cool. So my family is from New York by way of Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. I was raised by New Yorkers, which is like a very specific kind of Boricua. So there's a part of me that always feels like I'm from Lancaster, but I'm not. I moved here when I was 9 going on 10 in 2001, or 10 going on 11, I'm sorry. But we spent so many summers here in Lancaster that I did feel like Lancaster, and always do still feel like Lancaster's really formed who I am. I went to King Elementary for 5th grade and lived in the Southeast. We immediately moved like in with my uncle and aunt on Howard Avenue, and then up and down the block like 3 times on the same 500 block of Howard Avenue, and lived there until my sophomore year of college. But before that, I went to King Elementary, so I just like walked right up around the corner and down the street, and then attended Lancaster Mennonite actually for middle school and high school. It was a huge like culture shock for me to know that I'm living in this predominantly Puerto Rican and Black neighborhood and feeling like people look like me, we eat the same food, and we do the same things, and then going to Lancaster Mennonite, which is literally like between Tanger Outlet and a couple of farms and predominantly white. And yet I still loved my experience there. I think a lot of the values that I have in terms of community and sort of just like loving each other unconditionally have come from that Mennonite culture. But there were definitely challenges. I was like one of 3 Puerto Rican kids in my class, and the other 2 kids were my cousins. So it was really challenging in that way. And yet like we have things like 10,000 villages that started their work in Puerto Rico. So there's this tension, I think, with like missionary work and what that means and colonization and who I am. But I kind of buried a lot of that stuff, to be honest, until I finished college. So I went to Franklin and Marshall College, and I definitely have stayed in Lancaster my whole life. I did like 1 summer of study for the arts in the Art Students League of New York, but really just stayed in Lancaster and kind of resented my parents for encouraging me to do that. I didn't live on campus, so I lived off campus, and that was sort of another instance of feeling like simultaneously in a culture, but out of a culture. And F&M is also predominantly white, and a very different kind of whiteness, I would say, than Lancaster Mennonite was. So in a sense, like Lancaster Mennonite was a little bit easier because of the huge value set of community and family and sort of accepting each other. And then F&M was just a lot of wealthy people, and then you kind of knew if you weren't wealthy. So at F&M, I studied English Lit and studio art, and was involved in a ton of different clubs. I was editor-in-chief and graphics editor for Nonfiction Lit magazine, and our Lit magazine focused a lot on sort of calling things out, but also like being satirical. We were kind of like the Onion. So I've always been involved in some sort of like political satire or thinking critically about systems. And then when I graduated, I took a year off and got a job actually at F&M, where I still currently work as a photo and printmaking tech. And I've been there, I think, going on 8 years now in that position. And while like my official title is photo and printmaking tech, a lot of what I do is sort of mediating for students of color, or mediating for students that are from similar backgrounds as me, and helping them make it through the their undergrad. In the time that I took a break before actually going to grad school, I started to think a lot more about my experiences in these spaces, like going from LMH to the South and living in the Southeast, or still living in Lancaster and being a townie, quote unquote, and going to F&M, and how that shaped my identity. And then the ways that I sort of buried the microaggressions that I experienced as a non-white woman, and really understanding the ways that our city is still super informed by the segregation that really hasn't ended. So growing up like just south of King Street means something and still means something. And you can sort of see that visible divide. So my artwork started to shift in that way, where my personal work was looking a lot more at my identity. And then I started to get a lot more involved in what it looks like to actually do community-based art. And which is still what I consider like my primary focus for the work that I do now. Went to Drexel too, virtually, for my grad program for arts administration. So I can kind of like put some scholarship to the thoughts I was thinking and making work about, and finished my thesis on creative placemaking and placekeeping in the Latinx community in Lancaster City. And that kind of sparked my interest in getting more involved politically. I think 2016, 2017 was also like a tumultuous year for a lot of us for obvious reasons that I don't think I need to expound on. So I was inspired then to think like, okay, if I have all this background, did all this research on what's happening to my community in the artistic space, but I understand that there's like political offices locally that could impact the work that I know about, or the segregation that I'm seeing, or the impact that I'm seeing on the arts, then maybe I should run for something. So I ran for school board because education has also sort of been the underpinning of all of this. I'm also one of the first people in my family to actually, in my immediate family at least, to actually go to college and then actually go to grad school and get a master's in something. So that was a big deal. And I knew that was because my parents like heavy hand in terms of education, and they're pushing me towards education or getting an education. So I ran for school board and won, and have been on, I think this is my last year of my term on school board. We serve 4-year terms. So it's been a wild ride. I've been really involved in the equity work that we're doing now. We have an equity design team, and now Jessica is actually, or Professor Sponsor is part of our team, and we've expanded the work that we're doing. And it's been really cool to see the impact that we can have on not just like the youth and the children, but like the lasting impact that we'll have on our district. Because it's really, for me, it's about not just like changing systems, but radically transforming them and breaking down the stuff that doesn't work fully so that we can build new stuff. So yeah.
Very nice, thank you. Today we're going to be talking about our 3 guests' experiences in their respective offices, and any advice they would have to any of us interested in making change in our communities. We will have time for audience questions at the end of the panel. And however, we do have 6 questions that were ready to go. We probably won't have time to get to all of them. And I won't be able to stay for the entire time to proctor them, but Delana, who is the representative for the social media committee for BLAC, will be taking over once it's my time to go. That being said, we'll move on to the questions. I believe order-wise, we can just go in the order that you 3 introduced yourselves. I think that would be easiest and wouldn't have everyone talking over each other. And so for the first question, as elected officials of colors, what difficulties did you guys face when you were running for office, and what difficulties do you guys face being Black, Indigenous people of color still in your office?
Okay. I'm really regretting not having Jaime go first. No, I'm kidding. It's totally fine. Man, you know, I think that when I was running for office, I had a pretty easy go of it. I mean, I was fortunate enough that Salina had already done the work of getting on the board 2 years ahead of me, which I don't know if she mentioned it, but she was the first Latina to be on our school board. And our school district is over 60% Hispanic Latino. So the fact that it took that long, I think it was a surprise to me, but I'm so grateful that we are changing that now with the representation we have now. We also have 2 other Latinos that serve on the board as well, and our superintendent is now Latina. So I feel like we've finally gotten to a place where at least the representation feels balanced. But yeah, I would say that when I ran, some of the I guess tensions I had or things that were making me feel like, can I actually do this? Um, were more about just not understanding what all goes into running for office, which I think most people run up against because it's not a really transparent thing. We don't have even in high school, you think about it, there's people who maybe are running for office at like a high school level, but at least at McCaskey, we didn't have an official student government. We were working to get that off the ground. And there's not a lot of groups or organizations recruiting young people to run for office either. But I'm also one of the youngest people on the board with Salina. So it's like to be a younger person and then to not really know how to run for office. Those were the things that I kind of had to like do my research about. So I just started looking into and talking to other people who had run for office, what their recommendations were. And I did have the support of the local Democratic Party, so that helped as well, kind of to demystify the process. And then groups like Lancaster Stands Up that were trying to do that political education and recruit young progressive people to run for office. So I feel like I had a really fortunate time running because all of this stuff was kind of emerging within the last 3 or 4 years here, really, where we now have grassroots organizations who are looking to do this work. And I mean, the hurdles of being on a school board, I would say that it's mostly just that, like in any room, I have imposter syndrome. Yeah, I'm not really an academic. I come from this position as more of like a parent and someone who was a student of the school district and less of like an academic or a teacher or educator type of position. So sometimes just being nervous that I don't actually know what I'm talking about, even though I had the same information as everybody else in the room, it sometimes feels like, no, I'm not supposed to be here. So I think just gassing myself up and allowing myself to be honest in those moments is really helpful. But yeah, that's what I would say would be hurdles or challenges or things that are hard.
Thank you very much. Jamie?
Yeah, I think the best way that I can equate running for office and serving my first year in my first term is it's very similar to going to college. So being the first person in my family to go to college, I had no idea what I was doing as far as the process. I actually still remember my counselor, Coach Frederick, came up to me and was like, "What are you doing after high school?" And I said, "I'm going to college." He's like, "Well, did you apply?" I'm like, "No." And we're super past like these deadlines. He's like, "All right, come with me. I'll get you an application for Millersville." And I still remember halfway through the summer, "Did you fill out your FAFSA?" And I'm like, "What's a FAFSA?" So learning all these things for the first time was very difficult in that process. And running for office was very similar. There were a lot of moments where it was like, "Well, have you done this? And have you done that?" And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" Because I never knew anyone that ran for office before, at least very personally, and was able to guide me through the process. So luckily I had a lot of support from members in the community and folks that, I got to know folks that were involved in the process that were able to kind of coach me through kind of some of the more technical and logistical things, but then also some of the political things. So I always say, being an elected official, there's like these 2 parts to the job where there's the politics of things and then there's the government work that you have to learn as well of how things operate. So when it comes to the politics of things, it's how do you build relationships with people? What are the issues that matter to the community? And how do you navigate those things to come up with an opinion or come up with certain positions? And then there's the actual way that government functions. So, what is the process of introducing legislation, or what's the process of bringing up an idea or maybe giving some feedback for an idea? So when I think about those things, I think, especially as a person of color, there weren't too many people that I knew that look, or I didn't know anyone that looked like me that ran for office personally. So I had to learn a lot of those things on my own. And I think that's probably been one of the biggest challenges, is kind of learning on the job. One thing I will recommend is learning Robert's rules. That was that was one of the most awkward things that I had to learn, as far as like, okay, what am I allowed to do and what's the process? So that's been interesting. And I would say finally, it's probably having a little bit more of a public image, or more of a public life. I mean, it's not to the scale of bigger elected officials that have way more important jobs, but there is this sense of you're more in the public eye, which is a little bit challenging, because I'm more of a private person. I don't, I have a close circle of friends, but having to make sure that I'm available to people and making sure that I'm a little bit more outspoken about certain things has been a challenge, because I'm also a processor. I like to take things in. I like to go away with the information. I like to really dig and figure out how do I feel about this? What is my position on this? And sometimes people don't want that. They want to know right then and there, how do you feel about this specific issue? And that can be challenging. So learning how to kind of be in that public, I guess be a public figure, be more public, has definitely been a little bit of a challenge in my first year. So I would say those are probably some of the challenges that I've experienced.
Nice. Thank you very much. Salina, you're up next.
Yes. So I hate to be the Debbie Downer, but my campaign cycle was the worst. And I feel like finally now, the 4 years that I've been on the board, I feel a lot more confident, and like, I'm gonna swear, is that okay? I don't take bullshit.
I have no qualms with you swearing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, I don't really feel like I take bullshit anymore. So, and I'll explain why my campaign cycle was the worst. So it was the first time that I think people realized what school board directors do on like a national scale. And there was a lot more scrutiny on every level of electoral office, from municipal level to federal, like every single level. There were folks that were like, we need to get people in to protect things. And because of that, there was also like there was like a run for something campaign, and like a she runs for something campaign, and all these things that were emerging, but also very overwhelming. And I think fed this sort of fear-mongering urgency cycle that was part of the reason why I ran in the first place. And I think part of the reason why we've seen so much more diversity. So it worked to be like a good force, but also made our campaign cycles really stressful. So I don't know if Kareena went through this, but I actually had debates, or like, they didn't call them debates, but they were panels, because it was a contested race. And they were like, school boards don't usually do this, because people don't really remember that the school board directorship is like on the ticket. So it was like the first time in a really, really long time that so many people were fighting to be on the primary ballot. And then it was the first time that there was a contested seat for like the oh my God, I'm blanking on what the normal election is, like the actual November cycle. And there was some mudslinging, I would say. I did not get the support of the Democratic committee. They chose to leave. So they would normally support as many seats are open, and they chose to support an incumbent and 2 other people, but left the 4th seat that they normally would support open. So there was like 3 or 4 of us that were sort of up in the air with no support from any party. And that was sort of controversial, because the 3 people that they chose to support were all white. And they were like, the people that approached me that were like, you would be really great for this, you should run, were like, they're looking for younger people of color. And all of the people that they left hanging were younger people of color. So I think the Democratic committee, the city committee, has changed a lot because of that sort of cycle, because it also happened like for city council, for any of the other seats that were open. The treasurer was a contested thing. And I think it was just like a really unique blip in Lancaster City history that sort of, I guess because we have Jaime and Kareena, worked out for the better. And for like this past city council cycle, I think it's a much more diverse committee than it's ever been, and especially for school board. So the hell was worth it. But I think what I was not expecting was, I think at one point, I was called like the whitest of all of the candidates for color on social media, and like things went like not viral, but like Lancaster viral. So they were sharing these things, and they were like, oh, well, because she went to F&M, because she's like teaches, and because she's quote unquote disconnected from her community, which I'm like on the ground all the time. Then she doesn't deserve to be on the board. But it was just really complicated and weird, and brought up a lot of stuff that I thought I had dealt with in terms of my identity, and being like, I recognize the privilege of being like a non-white person, but not necessarily like I can pass, I guess, as something other. I'm racially ambiguous. So I recognize that, but then I also want to acknowledge like, probably not great to be like, you're the whitest of all of the people of color. So it was complicated and weird. So kind of going into being on the school board, it was just like, okay, I can put all that behind me. We got it. And it was a big deal. And there were some historic moments, I think, for everybody that was running for something that season. And then I had to learn, like Jaime said, learn Robert's rules. And I'm not the type of person that likes to shut up when I'm supposed to. Like if I want to say something, I want to say it. So that's still a challenge for me. But at the same time, I think part of the reason why I was interested in running was for exactly the same reasons that Kareena was saying, like highlighting how hard it is to even figure out like how to be a valid candidate to then be on the primary ballot. Like you have to get signatures, the signatures have to look a certain way, and they can only be from this person, these people on a certain date, and people can contest your signatures, and that's just to get on the primary ballot. And all of that stuff I feel like is a form of suppression, because the harder it is to get to something, the less likely people that don't quote unquote understand it are going to do it. So I was like, even though this feels awful, I'm going to do it so then I can turn around and be like, this is how it gets done. And I think even like some of the stuff that we talk about publicly, I think our past few meetings have been really challenging because we're dealing with a freaking pandemic that none of us wanted, and a federal government that's super inadequate in terms of dealing with public education during a pandemic, and refusing to give us any additional funding or support, or even suspending sort of legal policies that would put us in a bind. Like it's just such a mess. And I think for other people that are watching our meetings, and even for us, it sometimes feels like our meetings are really messy. And yet I'm really proud of that. I'm proud that we're willing to disagree, that we're willing to sort of have these heated debates, because I feel like that's the whole point of public office. The whole point is that we're the voice of the people, and that we're making it sort of transparent and open what's actually happening in the systems that heavily impact them. So even though it was like hell getting into it, I love what I do. And it's still stressful. I think another challenge is just like knowing that as a Latina and as a woman, there's like compounding identity. So as a woman, I'm viewed a particular way. I'm treated a particular way. I'm viewed as like more loud maybe than I am, or more passionate than I am because I talk with my hands, or because I say things a certain way. And I know that's race and gendered for sure. And I don't think that's ever gonna go away. But yeah, I think it's like, if you're interested, be ready.
Gotcha. Thank you very much for that answer. All of you guys gave pretty good answers to the question, so I appreciate that. This will be the point that I am leaving. However, Delana will be taking over proctoring the questions. Seriously, thank you guys for coming. Thank you guys for responding so swiftly to my emails. I will 100% be sure to keep in touch with you guys. Otherwise, have a good rest of your afternoon, please.
Thanks, Jazine.
So hi, I'm gonna continue on with this question. Issues of police violence were discussed and protested here in Lancaster this summer. How do you view your office in relationship to those protests and other conversations about police violence, institutional racism, and systemic inequities? And we'll start with Kareena.
Thanks so much for that question. I think for our school board, it has been something that we have been bringing up and discussing, but it's hard for us with the way our meetings are structured, with the way everything is, to focus in very specifically on the moment and tackle it in a very swift way. I think that this, everything that's going on, not only in our city, but I mean, we're seeing things going on in Philadelphia right now, and nationally, people are protesting, against police violence. And I think it's pretty obvious that our system is broken and that we need reform, and change. I think some people would say that the whole system just needs to be uprooted and redesigned, and I would agree with that. But for a school board, I think that our role is really to make sure that our students know that we support them, and giving opportunity for student voice. And I think that's something that we are trying to do more of. Salina, I'm sure, can talk a lot more about the equity design team and the work that that committee has been doing for the last few years, just around making sure that our students can have these conversations and feel empowered to have these conversations. Because really, I think that's where the change is going to come from. I don't think it's going to come from a system of education that is also, I mean, we know is also racist, or racially biased. So I don't expect for us to be the ones to create a lot of change, but I do expect us to elevate student voice and make sure that our community knows that we stand with them and not against them.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the biggest realizations of being in this position on city council is realizing sometimes how limited you are, which can be sometimes very defeating when there are so many major issues that are affecting us locally, nationally, and as we're seeing all around the world. But I think it's very important to realize, okay, so what can I do? What are some things that I can influence or control or have a say in? So one of those things is having more conversations with different stakeholders in elected positions. So state level elected officials, and making sure that as a councilman, I am talking about some of the issues that are affecting my city that they need to be aware of, that maybe they're not of, where they may have more decision-making power or more influence on some things that can change. I mentioned earlier that, one of the reasons why I decided to run for office was, the inequalities that existed within Lancaster City, specifically around economic development and community development. Some of the things that we're seeing now with, public safety and, kind of a lack of trust between community members and our public safety officials, police officers specifically, that's existed my entire life and before I was even born, right? Like, these are things that have plagued communities of color for centuries. And I think we're having this unique moment in history where we're all forced to really look at it and figure out what is our part to play in making sure that this changes for the future. From a city council level, I think it's important to make sure that, unfortunately, I'm not in there day to day doing the work, right? Those are the directors of the city. That's the mayor. Those are the folks that are in charge of each department. And it's super important that each of them buy into the decisions that they make having some sort of racial and equitable lens, and making sure that the decisions they make are taken into account, racial equity. So one of the things that, I've been excited about is I've been able to have, specifically with the Director of Economic Development, a lot of these conversations when it comes to new development projects, new procedures, new processes, that really looks at all of these projects in a way through an equity lens and also a sustainability lens, from an environmental standpoint. So being able to have these conversations, it doesn't really necessarily always translate into policy, but it has an influence over, okay, how are we going to how are we going to do things moving forward? Who are we going to hire? When we're having conversations with developers, what are priorities for our city? And making sure that we continue to have those types of conversations. Right now, the city is in search of a new police chief. That's an opportunity to make sure that whoever fills that position is bought into the fact that they're going to serve the community through this lens of equity, and true public safety that involves trust and incorporating the community into their service. And to me, that's exciting because it's an opportunity, as I forget if Kareena or Salina mentioned this, but to transform a system within our city. So I'm excited about that, but it can be overwhelming and challenging to know about these major systemic issues, and knowing that you play this very, very small part, but it's important to own that part.
Yeah, so I think for me, my experience specifically with policing has been growing up on Howard. Like, we knew that if something went down, we called the pastor of our church because the cops don't come to our block. And that happened, like happened multiple times. And I think our block had gone through like waves of tension internally. And I just kind of grew up knowing that the cops aren't there for us, essentially. And I alluded to the idea of like that boundary south of King. My sophomore year of college, my parents agreed to move to West Walnut Street, which is on the north side of town, very close to F&M, so I could walk to campus instead of having to walk from Howard Avenue all the way to F&M like I did. So we went from the southeast to the northwest end of town, and it was massively different, including the fact that the cops were called on us multiple times for playing music too loud on a Friday, because my dad was used to pulling his car up onto the curb like we used to do in the southeast and fixing it like on the curb, which I guess technically is not legal. Jamie can probably tell us what city council ordinance says that. But it was like these harmless acts that we were so used to in our community and that everybody did, and there was sort of different rules there, were treated as like crime or criminalized in the northwest end of town. So I've always been very skeptical of the police. My dad was violently and very publicly arrested for overdue parking tickets in our neighborhood. And ever since then, I've always been a little bit, not a little bit, a lot of it skeptical of the police. I'm very much, my personal politic is that we do need to defund police and radically look at ways that we can actually fund public schools or fund the services that would prevent things from getting as escalated as they are currently. I think one of my, and then I think there's a personal politic that tends to be much more radical and sort of left leaning than the politic that I can do as a board director. Because I think one of the things that I was aware of, but not totally aware of, or sort of aware of the impact, was that I'm one of 9 people. So even if I always vote in my conscience or vote in my political leaning, things will pass and I can't really do anything about it outside of sort of be a check and balance. And that's exhausting in a lot of ways sometimes. And I think Kareena and I are approaching it from like, okay, if we're having these conversations nationally about what policing looks like, what literally does it mean to have police in our schools, and is it necessary? And I think for me, I question that because I went to Lancaster Mennonite, and it's not a small school, but a big enough school, and we never had police in our building, and it was elementary, middle, and high school, and we never had to call the police when there was a fight. There was always like this sort of internal community care that took care of a lot of that. So I wonder, what does it mean then for a predominantly white school to not have police? And we see this in surrounding districts, to not have police in their schools, and then are predominantly Latinx and Black schools to have police in their buildings. And what does it mean if there's a police officer in an elementary school? Like, why does that have to be there? And what if it's only in a certain elementary school? So these are things that I think we're approaching, sort of trying to balance our personal politic and what's good for the community, and how quickly we can get anything done in sort of in the positions that we're in. So right now we're just in sort of let's ask questions phase to get the conversation started. And I think then on the flip side, being involved in community organizing and community activism, what we want is those big things to pass, those big laws to pass, those big policies to pass that are flashy and nice and meaty. And yet it takes all of these little things to get to that. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough. And I think we need all of it. Like, we need the protests, we need the posters, we need people running for office that are much more radical or more interested in reform and transformation, because it all works towards the same goal. I don't think it's a one or the other thing, but it is very challenging sometimes to be a person that has like a much more radical personal politic and like posting on social media about what I believe, and then realizing like, and I can't make it move as fast as I want it to. Kareena mentioned the equity design teamwork that we started, and I can really quickly talk about that. So when I first started on the school board, Dr. Rao was part of a majority sort of Southern superintendents and school leaders group for it was the Racial Equity Network, and she was a fellow. And one of her jobs as a fellow through that program was to learn the tools to then take to her district to look critically at what's happening in terms of racial equity in our district. And it's really the first time that we've done something this concentrated and understood, and had a leader that understood like this takes many, many years of work, rather than like when we're going to do like one anti-racism training and everything is fine and we're good. So for the past 4 years, we first took a really deep dive in looking at data around sort of what we're talking about now, like the policing of Black and brown children. And the way that manifests in schools is through suspension and expulsion. And we noticed that it really ticks up between that 5th and 6th grade transition. So, and it's like heartbreaking to know that instance in a child's life might actually change the trajectory for them in the future. And we talk about the school to prison pipeline, and that's literally what we were interrogating, and then trying to figure out, okay, now how do we set up supports so that doesn't happen anymore? And for us, it looked like a mentorship program, which we already kind of had with Advantage Lancaster, but we were trying to make it more district, like couch within the district and couch within our framework, alongside the other programs that were already happening. And looking at what does it look like to pair up 5th and 6th grade boys with Black and brown leaders in the community. And right now it's very gendered. I'm also fighting for less gendering in our schools, but there's so many, fights you can do at the same time. But it's been a really cool project to watch, especially alums of SDOL come back and sit with current kids and talk about like, yeah, actually not much has changed, and how can we change that, and have those honest conversations. And then we also looked at having everybody that is around the child in our district being part of anti-racism training through Corwin Institute. And what we loved about that program, and the reason why we sort of outsourced it, was because they're experts and they have a 5-year approach. And then we revisit after that 5 years and say, okay, where do we have to start over again? Understanding that there's a lot of turnover, and understanding that like this issue it's been for centuries, and we're probably going to have to undo it for just as long. So that's been, I think, related to issues of policing and issues of racial equity. But I think it's also so challenging when you understand that it's incremental and small. I'm also part of the NAACP education committee. So that's kind of where I get like the juices out for the like sort of quick and much more maybe radical stuff that I can't necessarily do on the board. But I do see it as bridge building, and feeling like if I can do some of the grassroots stuff and be part of this board, then maybe we can make something happen a little bit faster.
All right, thank you all for sharing that. I wanted to give you each 30 seconds to give advice to anyone who wants to run for office or maybe just wants to take more action in their communities. And then we're going to open it up to the questions for everyone else to answer questions. So.
Okay. So I would just thank you all for having me here today first. It's been really lovely. And, a lot of people think that because we're on a board together that Salina or I and other board members get to spend a lot of time with each other. We absolutely do not. So we do a lot of our meeting and board time, like what y'all see in our public meetings. That's how much time we get to spend together. But so this has been great. But I would say that, first of all, please vote. If you haven't voted yet this Tuesday, obviously, please make it to the polls and vote that way if that's the way you need to vote. If you plan on voting by mail, it's probably better that you turn it in person at this point. So please get that done if you haven't yet. And the other thing I would say, if you're considering running for office, is absolutely do it. Please reach out to me. I can share my contact information. Reach out to organizations like Lancaster Stands Up, or if you identify with the Democratic Party, go ahead and reach out to them, because we need more young people to run for office. And I would just encourage you to continue to look into it and see what office sounds right for you. There's also a lot of boards in our city that a lot of people don't realize you do not have to be an elected official to get on a board or serve in a community board. And that's another way that you can start getting involved in our community. We really need that. Our board service, as tedious as it can be sometimes, is really crucial, and we need more young progressive people at the table.
So I'm pretty much going to repeat what Kareena just said, because that was going to be my advice. Is one, make sure you get out there and vote on November 3rd if you haven't already. But second, I do think one thing I learned about this process is that I was very adamant about people should run for office. We need more young people, but there's also so many other ways to engage. And one of the things that I learned was about all the boards, commissions, and authorities that exist within specifically the city of Lancaster, but also the county. And if you live in another township or borough, they also have so much more. So if there's some specific issue that you're passionate about, someone, for example, that I knew was very passionate about speeding on his block. So I told him about the traffic commission that exists to talk about, everything from speed bumps and signs to speed limits and such. So there's all types of different boards and commissions that you can find on the City of Lancaster's website. And it's a great way to get engaged. Also attending meetings. So, COVID sucks, but the one good thing is that everything has been virtual. And if you're interested in watching a meeting, we're all on Zoom and they stream it all on YouTube. So if you're interested in seeing what a council meeting looks like and what a school board meeting looks like, you're able to see what they're being streamed right now. So you can check those out as well. So that would be my advice: is get engaged, in some capacity to make sure that you're informed and then pass that information along.
That I was going to say the same exact thing. Before I ran for school board, I attended like a year's worth, maybe a year and a half's worth of school board meetings, just sitting in the audience. Partially because I was like, I don't know what I'm going to get myself into. I need to understand this. And then I quickly realizing, and I attended like a bunch of city council meetings before then too. And I remember my first city council meeting, I entered through the wrong door and it felt really awkward. And then I didn't understand like where the agenda was, because they didn't used to project it the way they do. And I just felt lost. And I know a lot of people feel like it's even intimidating to walk through city hall doors to get to the city council meeting, or even to walk through the doors to get to a school board meeting. And like even our public comment is complicated. And those are all things that I'm like, I wish I could change it. But it is what it is. And I think starting to practice by going to the meetings is great. And with COVID, it's so much less awkward because you can't enter through a wrong door. And you don't have to worry about like standing and sitting for things. It felt a lot like going to church to me the first time I attended. But I think and we have a backlog now of all of these meetings, so it's a little bit easier to watch them from what was going on before. I think for school board, things that I wish I had understood more, even before deciding if I wanted to run, was I knew we're a little bit different than some other boards. We meet in what's called a committee of the whole. So for two of our meetings, it's a much more discussion based, and then our last meeting is vote based. So I think that's like, those little nuances are really important to understand, and you don't understand them unless you actually attend the meetings. And the other thing I wish I really understood in terms of like how much time I'm committing is, one, school board directors do not get paid for our position. It's purely volunteer. We run and we get elected, but we do not get paid at all for the work that we do. And we're sometimes spending upwards of like 20, 30 hours a week. And it fluctuates heavily because there are some times where we don't have much to talk about, but then all of a sudden we're meeting every day to talk about stuff. And then we can't always meet in mass because of Robert's rules. So we have to talk about things and sort of let our rough drafts air out in public. And that's really challenging. Plus you have to be on several other committees. So even though we have the school board that meets 3 times a month, I'm also on the Law Academia committee as a non-voting member that meets once a month and sometimes more. And then I'm on the equity design team that meets once every other month and now once a month. And we have another committee for equity design team that I'll be on. So that's 2 more meetings that I'm committing to. And then I'm on the policy committee for school board. So it really adds up very, very quickly. And I think that's like, it's no shame to be like, wow, I do not have time for this. But that also means that all those little committees that I just mentioned have people that are not school board directors that are on them. And I think sometimes we like talk about the seat at the table and we talk about like running for something, but that's really not the only way. Like if you wanted to be part of the equity design team, you can just be part of the equity design team and focus purely on that. Whereas like a lot of us are forced to sort of spread ourselves thin because we were taught the only way to get involved is to do it the sort of quote unquote official way. So I think there's multiple ways to tackle this. And I'm happy to talk to folks more about it if they're interested. And I was also on the Lancaster Public Art Board, which is another sort of board / committee that's not necessarily voted. I believe you were appointed for Lancaster Public Art. So there's like a little bit of a process, but that's another thing that you can get involved in and just sort of feel it out before you actually commit 100% to something. And also vote on November 3rd, please, or send in your mail-in ballots right now. Like walk down the street and put it in the Dropbox.
Thank you guys for coming and for sharing. If anyone wants to ask their own questions, now would be the time for that.
You're all amazing.
Agreed.
I have one quick question. As you think about how you're young, you've identified as persons of color, sometimes there's some gender pieces in here. How do you see yourself being positioned in conversations with your colleagues? And then how do you have to position yourself then in order to be heard?
I can talk about that because I think about that a lot, and Kareena knows this. So I think prior to Kareena being on the board, I think we play off of each other when we agree on things sometimes, because I often felt, especially the first couple of years, if I asked questions, I was made to feel stupid, either because people would explain it in a way that felt like I should have known something or something. It's really belittling, and I think that's definitely gendered and raced. But I also have noticed specifically on the gender side that sometimes I will say something and there's like dead silence, and then a man on the board will say it almost verbatim and not give anybody else credit. And this has happened to other women on the board. And they're like, wow, that was so insightful. Which is like, you know, I think every woman on this call or femme on this call has experienced that. And it's like, yes. So I think like there are certain men on the board that I know that they have to do that in order for people to hear it, and then we'll give credit. But then I think there's also just a culture of that happening, whether they mean it maliciously or not, that like our ideas mean more if they're filtered through the mouths of testosterone. So I think that's really frustrating sometimes, and I think it doesn't really go away. And I can say it, like I can bring it up during meetings and to make everybody uncomfortable, which I do. But it doesn't really do anything but make everybody uncomfortable. So it's just like, if I don't have another person on my team, like if I don't have a Kareena, then it's really lonely. But now I have other women on the board that see it and acknowledge it. And now I'm starting to finally feel like, okay, I'm not crazy, because it does make you feel really crazy.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and just add that so I started this year, right? The pandemic happened. So we only had about maybe 3 months or so of in-person meetings before we had to go to a more like Zoom-based virtual setup for our meetings. And it was hard, I think, for me to feel comfortable just unmuting myself and speaking up, because there's so many people on the board who have been on the board before, are used to, speaking in a more informal meeting style. I mean, we have Robert's rules, but at the same time, when it's open for discussion, it's just open for discussion. It's not, a structured kind of meeting where it's your turn to speak. So sometimes I would find myself like unable to speak up because it just felt like I don't want to interrupt them, or I don't want to interrupt this person. And we kind of had to name it. Like Salina was saying, like sometimes it's just really good to name that as the meeting's going on, so that people are more aware that, we haven't heard from half the board members. Why is that? Or, what's going on? So I think that has been something that's been a learning curve. And it does feel like, because I'm a woman, and because I'm, especially in the place where I'm at, where I feel like I'm an imposter in the room sometimes, as like a newbie and a first year board member, that like I don't always know when to speak up. So it is hard, but I think that, yeah, we are working on it. And our board, I feel, is probably one of the more progressive boards in Lancaster County, like overall. I mean, even other volunteer boards, I think we're probably one of the most progressive in that way. And so we are more mindful of the, intersectionality of all of our different board members, but it's still a balancing act. I mean, we're all human. We all carry biases with us.
Yeah, I'll comment briefly. I think, I'm in a lucky position where city council's the most diverse it's ever been. So there is that, walking into a room, it feels a little bit more comfortable, because there's 4 Puerto Ricans on city council. There's African Americans. It's super diverse. I mean, for the first time in its history, I think there's not one white male that is on city council. So that has allowed itself to be, at least for me, it's felt a little bit comfortable. I think internally there is this, sometimes this feeling of like, do I belong here? Right. And, Salina mentioned walking through those halls and being in city council and how weird it feels to be there, that I still feel, I mean, now it's on Zoom, so I'm in my attic, but when I was there, it was this like, oh, am I allowed to speak up? Am I allowed to make a suggestion? And it's like, no, you earned it. You're here, you're at this table for a reason. And it's continuing to tell yourself that, you have to continue to remind yourself of that. So that's probably been, very challenging, but luckily, because of the diversity of the council, it's been a little bit more comfortable, I think, for someone like me to kind of step in.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's almost 10 after 2, and I know all of you have to go back to work, and we really just so appreciate the time that you gave to our students today. It was just wonderful. Thank you so, so much for taking this time for them. I think they really appreciate it as well. We got a large lunchtime crowd, which usually they don't want to do anything like but eat lunch and chat. So we had quite a few students here, and so we really appreciate you doing this for them. And thank you so much, and making this connection with BLAC, which we're so glad is getting off the ground and really thriving this year. So despite the pandemic. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you everyone for coming. Have a good day.